The summer of 1889 came to Arizona territory, the way it always did, without apology. The heat arrived before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridgeline, pressing down on the red rock and the dry grass and the pale caliche dust of the high desert floor, with a weight that felt less like weather and more like judgment. By 7 in the morning, the air above the flats shimmered in long, wavering columns that turned the distant mesas into liquid shapes, their hard edges dissolving into the sky above them. By 9, the heat burned. By noon, it had reduced the landscape to a kind of beautiful, merciless silence, in which only the things built to survive such conditions remained. Standing the saguaro with their pleated trunks storing water through the dry months. The ocotillo with their thin, red-tipped branches reaching skyward like something halfway between a plant and a warning. The red sandstone itself, which had been here before any of it, and would be here long after. Cora Hartwell had not been built for Arizona. She had been built for the green hill country of central Texas, for the cedar shade and the limestone creek beds, and the particular quality of light in early October, when the whole world turned gold and cool, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke from neighboring farms, and the sound of her father's voice carried easily across the yard in the evening, because there was no wind, and no distance could diminish it. She had been built for the sound of his boots on the wooden porch steps, for the smell of pipe tobacco and India ink, and the old canvas maps he spread across the kitchen table on winter nights, weighing the corners with river stones he carried in his coat pockets, specifically for that purpose, tracing routes with his finger, and explaining in the patient voice he reserved for things he loved, the language the land used to describe itself. Each line is a season, he would say, pointing to the strata in a piece of limestone. He'd cut cross-section and set on the table beside the map. Each color is a condition. The dark bands are wet years. The pale ones are drought. The land writes everything down, Cora Bird. You just have to learn to read it. She had learned. She had learned the way children learn the things that matter most, not as lessons, but as part of the texture of daily life, absorbed gradually through proximity and repetition, until the knowledge became less like something she had been taught and more like something she had always known. She was 19 years old. She was carrying a canvas satchel with a broken strap she had knotted and re-knotted 3 times over the past 2 weeks, a wool coat she had not needed since crossing the New Mexico border 4 days ago, and a manila envelope that contained the only thing her father had left her when the fever took him 6 weeks before. She did not believe it was fever. The stagecoach from Tucson deposited her at the edge of redemption in the late morning, pulling to a stop in front of the stage office with the particular abruptness of a driver who had learned that passengers would find their own way off if given time, and that time was something the schedule did not provide. Cora climbed down without assistance, settled the satchel strap across her left shoulder, and stood in the red dust of the main street and looked at the town her father had spent the last months of his life working near. Redemption was the kind of town that had grown up fast and mean around a single commodity copper. In this case, and had not yet decided whether it intended to become something permanent or simply bleed the earth until there was nothing left and move on. Main Street was wide and unpaved, ankle-deep in red dust that coated everything. It touched the boardwalks, the hitching rails, the horses standing at them, the boots of the men who walked the planks. Two saloons faced each other from opposite sides of the street, like men squaring off before an argument that both parties knew was coming. A general store with a faded awning, a land office with a hand-lettered sign above the door, a bank with new brick facing that looked out of place against the older, rougher-built structures around it, too solid, too deliberate. The construction of someone who had decided that the town was going to last, whether the town knew it yet or not. A doctor's office with drawn curtains despite the hour. The people of Redemption watched her the way people in small towns watch strangers openly without apology, with the particular calculation of those who have learned that everyone who arrives is either carrying something useful or something dangerous, and that the difference between the two is not always immediately apparent. Cora ignored them. She had grown up watching her father walk into rooms full of men who underestimated him. Rooms full of mine owners and railroad men and territorial officials who looked at a surveyor with mud on his boots and saw a hired hand, rather than the person who understood the ground they were all standing on better than any of them. And she had learned from years of watching that the best response to being underestimated was to move forward, as though the estimation had not occurred. She needed water, and she needed the land office. She found both on the same side of the street. The water came from a tin cup on a barrel outside the general store, left for anyone who needed it, which in Arizona in the summer was everyone. She drank 2 cups, felt the coolness of it spread through her chest, and walked to the land office. The man behind the counter was a clerk of about 50 with ink-stained fingers and the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent decades reading small print in poor light. He had a careful, unhurried manner that suggested he had been at this desk for a long time and expected to be at it for considerably longer. He took the manila envelope she offered him, removed the deed inside, and studied it with the attention of a man who understood that documents were the only things in this part of the world that didn't lie to you if you knew how to read them. He looked up at her over the top of his reading spectacles. "Weston Hartwell," he said. The name of her father. The name of the man who had filed this claim 18 months ago, who had written her a letter in January explaining that he had found something promising in the Copper Hollow country south of Redemption. Not copper, he had been careful to say, but something worth understanding, who had sent her $20 in March with a note that said only nearly there. Cora Bird in his cramped surveyor's hand, and who had been buried in a county cemetery in May with no family present, because Cora had not received word of his death until 3 weeks after it happened, and by then there was nothing left to attend. "His daughter," she said. "The claim transfers on his death. It says so in the document section 3, second paragraph." The clerk looked at the document again. He found section 3, second paragraph. He read it. He looked at her. He said nothing, but something shifted in his expression. Small, careful. A particular kind of neutralizing that she had seen before on the faces of people who had been instructed to be unhelpful and were trying to accomplish this without appearing to have been instructed. He had been told to expect her or someone like her. That was what the expression meant. Before he could speak, the door behind her opened. She knew before she turned. The room changed the way rooms change. When a particular kind of man enters, not through any single dramatic signal, but through the aggregate of many small ones, the way a weather system announces itself before the clouds arrive. The air pressure altered slightly. The clerk's posture adjusted by a degree she would not have noticed if she had not been paying attention. The quality of the silence became different, heavier, attended. Declan Murtaugh was a large man in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, running to weight in the way that men do when they have been physically capable for a long time, and have reached an age where capability has been replaced by authority, and authority requires less movement. His face had once been handsome, and had since become something more useful, authoritative, composed, capable of warmth, and just as capable of its complete opposite. He wore a good suit, dark wool in the July heat, which was unusual in Redemption. He wore it the way a man wears something that fits him correctly, without thinking about it, which told her he had been wearing good suits for long enough that they no longer felt like a costume. He was flanked by two men she mentally catalogued under the category of hired weight. One was tall and thin, with the deliberate stillness of a man trained to read terrain and the people moving through it. The other was shorter, broader, with a flattened nose that spoke of a history of physical disagreement. They both wore iron on their hips, worn and practical, not the decorative kind. Murtaugh glanced at the envelope on the counter. He looked at Cora. He smiled. It was a real smile, which was the most precise kind of warning. "Hartwell's girl," he said. Not a question. The certainty of a man who had been briefed. Someone had sent word from Tucson, or from the stage office, or from both. She had been expected. He had been waiting. She filed all of this without changing her expression. "Weston Hartwell filed a claim on Copper Hollow," she said. "He's deceased. I'm here to take possession. The transfer is documented." Murtaugh moved to the counter with the unhurried ease of a man for whom nothing in his territory moved without his awareness, let alone his permission. He picked up the manila envelope from the counter beside the deed. He did not ask. He simply took it the way men of his type take things, not with aggression, not with ceremony, but with the casual certainty of someone who has never in recent memory been required to account for a gesture. He opened the envelope. He read the deed with the performance of careful attention slower than necessary. With the reading glasses he produced from his breast pocket, taking his time, in the way that men take time, when the point of the taking is the demonstration that time is theirs to take. Then he looked around at the other men in the room. The clerk, who had gone. Very still. The tall tracker, the shorter one with the broken nose. And he laughed. The laugh filled the room. It was a genuine laugh, not a performance of one which was worse, because genuine laughter at your expense contains no heat you can productively push back against. It was the sound of a man who had encountered something he found not threatening, but absurd, and who was sufficiently secure to find it funny. Weston Hartwell filed on a dead whole girl. He said it clearly at a volume that would carry through the open window to the boardwalk outside. Copper Hollow eats men whole. That canyon is played out and bone dry and sheer wall from the bottom, with no way in or out except the old trestle at the top, and the trestle has been condemned since '84. He set the envelope on the counter and pushed it back toward her with one finger, as though returning something whose value was too low to warrant the full movement of his hand. "It ate your father. Barren rock and lizards not worth the paper it's written on." He knew her father's name. He had used it twice, now once when he entered, and once just now with the familiarity of a man who had thought about the name. Specifically, not generically. Specifically. The way you think about a problem that required solving. Cora Hartwell had learned growing up with a father who read the land for a living that the most important information was rarely what people said. It was what their saying revealed about what they already knew. Murtaugh already knew about her father. He had already thought about the claim. He had been waiting for her to arrive, and whatever the expression on his face said about the claim being worthless, the fact that he had been waiting said something different entirely. "I'd like to see the property," she said. Murtaugh studied her for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing something he had initially classified as minor. Then the smile returned, smaller and more private. "Of course you would," he said. "A man's daughter ought to see what he was working on. Least we can do." He glanced at the tall tracker. "Dross, take Miss Hartwell out to the hollow. Let her see it for herself." They rode south out of Redemption in the late morning. 4 of them Cora on a horse from the livery, Murtaugh on a gray stallion, Dross on a bay, and the shorter man on a pinto. They flanked her in the easy, relaxed positioning of people who were not escorting someone, but containing them. And the difference between the two was something she felt rather than saw, a pressure at the edges of her peripheral vision. She said nothing and watched the land. The desert south of Redemption opened up through the Creosote and Ocotillo flats before the ground began to rise and corrugate into the harder country, where the flat surface of the earth gave way to the geology beneath it, the tilted strata, the exposed formations, the places where erosion had cut through the surface. Skin of the world, and revealed what lay underneath, which in this part of Arizona was primarily red sandstone, laid down in shallow seas and river deltas, before any of the creatures walking over it had evolved patient and ancient and entirely indifferent to what moved across its surface. Her father had loved this country. He had not been built for it either, not physically. He had been a Texas man, a limestone and cedar man, more comfortable with the modest green hills of the hill country than with the vertical and violent topography of Canyon, Arizona. But he had loved it with the particular passion of someone who has encountered a language more complex than any they have previously studied and has found themselves equal to learning it. He had been here on this road going south toward Copper Hollow for months before he died. She could feel the fact of it in the landscape the way you feel a presence you cannot see. The Cathedral of Bones announced itself before it became visible. She heard at first a low, resonant sound she could not immediately identify, a kind of hollow vibration that seemed to come not from any single source, but from the earth itself, or from the wind, moving through something enormous and partly hollow that the earth held in place. It was felt as much as heard a low pressure in the sternum, a sound at the lower edge of audibility. Then she smelled it, old wood and hot iron, and something deep and mineral and ancient. The smell of a structure that had been sitting in the desert sun for years and had absorbed that sun into its fabric until it was part of the thing itself. Then she came around the last curve of the trail, and she saw it. The trestle bridge crossed the canyon at its widest point, 90 feet above the canyon floor. It had been built in 1881 by the Consolidated Copper and Railway Company as part of an ambitious plan to run a spur line through the canyon country to connect 3 promising mine sites to the main rail line to Tucson. The mine sites had proved less promising than the company's prospectus had advertised. The investors who had read the prospectus in offices in San Francisco and New York had discovered this fact. At the same time, they discovered that their money was gone. The company had dissolved in 1884. The tracks had been pulled for salvage, which was straightforward. The trestle itself, 340 feet of hand-hewn timber, iron-bolted, cross-braced, and counter-braced in the engineering fashion of the period, designed to carry the weight of loaded ore cars across a canyon that offered no other crossing, had been left standing, because the cost of demolishing it exceeded what anyone remaining in the enterprise was willing to spend on a structure in a played-out canyon in the middle of nowhere. 7 years of Arizona weather had worked on it with the patient thoroughness that Arizona weather applied to everything. The wood had gone the color of old bone gray-brown, cracked along the grain, bleached by 10,000 hours of direct sun, until the surface was silver in some lights and the color of ash in others. Several of the cross members on the south end had given way under the combined assault of heat expansion, moisture contraction, and the slow degradation of the iron bolts that held them, and they hung at broken angles, dangling above the canyon floor on their remaining connections, like the fingers of a hand reaching down from an enormous height towards something it could not quite reach. The main uprights, 12 of them, rising from the canyon walls on both sides, and the canyon floor at 4 points, had held. They were massive timbers, old-growth ponderosa pine, from higher elevations, each one 18 inches across. At the base, sunk into the rock with iron pins, and the weight of everything above them. They were gray and cracked, and the iron bolts that banded them had bled long orange-red streaks of rust down their sides like old wounds. They were still standing. They were going to be standing for a long time yet. The whole structure vibrated in the canyon wind with a low, sustained moan that traveled up through the sandstone walls of the canyon and into the soles of your feet. When you stood on the rim, a sound like a cathedral organ played at its lowest register, a sound that was less heard than absorbed. It was the most extraordinary thing Cora Hartwell had ever seen in 19 years of looking at things. It was also, she understood at the same moment she registered its size and condition, the reason her father had filed a claim here. Not for copper Weston. Hartwell had been a surveyor for 20 years, and he had known played-out copper country when he rode through it, and he had told her in his January letter explicitly that the copper was not the point. What the trestle told anyone who looked at it carefully with the eyes her father had taught her to use was that a structure of that scale and that precision, not a mining structure, an engineering structure, the kind of structure that required surveyors and engineers and the full institutional weight of a railway company, had been positioned where it was for specific geological reasons. The canyon it crossed was not random. The canyon was there because something underneath it had shaped it from below. because the water table in this part of the territory had particular characteristics, because the geology of the underlying rock was not what the surrounding surface suggested. A played-out copper canyon did not require a 340-foot railway trestle. The railway company had not built that trestle to move copper. They had built it to move something that required crossing the canyon, and the canyon was here because the ground held something the canyon was revealing through its own erosion. Her father had known this. He had come here, surveyed the canyon country, read what the land was writing, and filed a claim. And then he had died. Satisfied, Murtaugh said. He had reined in at the canyon rim 15 feet from the edge with the comfortable authority of a man who had been here before and had no particular feelings about it. The canyon floor was 90 feet below. Cora looked at it directly. The walls were sheer red sandstone vertical for the first 40 or 50 feet, with no ledges, no cracks wide enough to put a hand in, no paths worn by anything larger than a lizard. The trestle crossed above her, its shadow falling diagonally across the canyon floor as the sun moved through its arc. The sound it made was lower from here, closer to vibration than to sound felt in the sternum and the jaw. At the bottom, pale boulders, old rockfall debris, the scattered detritus of a canyon floor that had been accumulating material for centuries. And at the base of the main central pier, the largest of the structural uprights sunk into the bedrock at the canyon's midpoint, directly below the apex of the trestle, the ground was a different color. Not the rust red of the oxidized sandstone that covered everything else, not the pale gray of the limestone debris. Dark. A deep brown that was almost black in the shadow of the pier, with a surface quality she recognized from hundreds of miles of survey work alongside her father, from hundreds of mornings, when he had knelt in the dirt of a dry creek bed or a desert flat or a canyon bottom and pressed his palm to the earth and said without looking up quietly, in the voice he used for things the land was telling him, rather than things he was telling her, the driest ground remembers the deepest water. "I'd like to go down and look," she said. "No way down," Murtaugh said. The answer came too fast and too smoothly. Prepared. "That's what I've been telling you. That's why your father's claim is worthless. Can't access what you can't reach." He was not wrong that there was no obvious path down the canyon wall. The sheer faces offered nothing to a person who had not already identified a route. She could see that from the rim. What he was wrong about was the assumption that she would look where he was looking. Murtaugh's hand landed flat between her shoulder blades. The shove was not theatrical. It was efficient. The precise application of force at the exact moment her weight was committed forward, leaning out to look at the darker soil at the base of the pier, her center of gravity already beyond the point where she could pull it back without something to push against. He had been watching for this moment. He had positioned himself behind her specifically to be ready for it. There was no warning. There was a hand, and then there was falling. She did not scream. The air left her body on impact with the first ledge of the canyon wall, a sloping section of sandstone 15 feet below the rim that she bounced from, before continuing the fall, and she was tumbling before her mind had processed the sequence of events. Sandstone raking across her palms, then her cheek, then her knees. the world rotating around some axis that had nothing to do with the horizon, the enormous shadow of the trestle sweeping past overhead as she fell past the line it cast. She hit the canyon floor on her right side. The impact was total. Her vision went white, then gray, then resolved slowly back into the visual world, the pale canyon walls, the gray-brown trestle above the strip of flat, blue sky between the rims. She breathed, or tried to. The air came in shallow and limited, rationed by whatever had happened to her right side. One rib, she thought, with the remote, clinical assessment of a person operating slightly outside the experience of pain. Maybe two. Her right shoulder had taken the wall on the way down. The arm would move, but at cost. Her left cheek was bleeding, the blood drying fast in the heat, tightening the skin as it went. Above her at the canyon rim, 3 silhouettes stood against the flat blue of the midday sky. Murtaugh held the manila envelope. He was looking at it, not at her. He had what he had come for. After a moment, without looking down, he turned and walked away from the rim, and Dross and the other man turned with him, and their footsteps on the rock receded, and then there was silence. Not the silence of absence, the silence of what remained when everything extraneous had been removed. Heat and height and the absolute geological indifference of a canyon that had been here for 10,000 years before her and would be here for 10,000 after. The trestle above her made its sound in the wind, low, resonant, continuous. She lay on the canyon floor and breathed and counted her available assets, which was what her father had taught her to do in difficult terrain before anything else. She had a damaged rib, a damaged shoulder, a bleeding face. No water. The satchel was still across her body. She had held it throughout the fall. Instinctively, the strap looped around her left wrist. Inside the satchel, the ledger her father had left his note, the oilcloth she had wrapped them in. The tools of the canyon were gone. No canteen, no rope. What she had was the knowledge her father had given her and the eyes he had trained. She looked at the ground. At the base of the main trestle pier, 20 yards from where she lay, the earth was darker. She could see it now, from below, as clearly as she had seen it from above, and it was not a trick of shadow or distance. The soil at the base of that pier was genuinely, unmistakably different in color and quality from the surrounding rock. Deep brown, near black. And in the heat of a July afternoon in the Arizona desert, it held a faint quality that dry desert soil did not hold. Moisture. The driest ground remembers the deepest water. She rolled onto her left side, pressed her palm against the canyon floor, and pushed herself upright. The rib made its opinion known loudly in the specific language of deep structural pain. She breathed through it the way her father had taught her to breathe through difficult terrain, not against the obstacle, but alongside it, acknowledging its existence, without conceding it authority over the next required movement. She walked to the base of the pier. She knelt carefully and pressed her fingers into the soil. Damp. Not wet, not a seep or a spring or any kind of running water visible on the surface, but genuinely and unmistakably damp, in the way that soil is damp when water moves through it slowly from deep underground, finding its patient way upward through fissures in the rock that no survey has recorded, because no one who surveyed this canyon thought there was anything here worth looking for. She followed the moisture. It was not a visible trail. It was a gradient darker soil, and then lighter, darker again, a pattern she tracked on her hands and knees across the canyon floor, pressing her fingers into the earth every few feet, and reading the result. The gradient led her across the floor, away from the open space beneath the trestle, toward the far end of the canyon, where an ancient rock fall had deposited an enormous tangle of sandstone slabs and boulders against the south wall. The boulders varied from the size of a wagon wheel to the size of a small house. They were stacked in the haphazard geometry of catastrophic collapse, and they filled the last 30 feet of the canyon completely wall to wall, an impenetrable mass of old rock. It looked like an ending. It was what endings looked like, she thought, when the person who had arranged them wanted to be certain. She put her right hand flat against the surface of the nearest boulder, resting her weight on it, and she felt what she had not seen. Air, not wind, not warmth. A slow, passive exhalation of cool air from somewhere within the rockfall, moving so gradually it was nearly below the threshold of perception, but cooler than the ambient air of the canyon floor, by a margin that was unmistakable once she was still enough to feel it. Cool air meant a void. A void in rock that should have been solid meant a space at the end of a canyon where a spring was feeding a moisture gradient across the floor, meant something that had been shaped either by water over time or by the hands of people who had understood what was here. She worked along the face of the rockfall, moving slowly and methodically, her left hand trailing the surface, feeling for the air. It took her 10 minutes. She found the opening behind a slab that had fallen at an angle against the canyon wall, leaving a gap between itself and the wall that was oriented horizontally, low, approximately the width of her shoulders, and narrower at the top. She removed the satchel from her shoulder. She pushed it through the gap ahead of her. Then she turned sideways, exhaled completely to reduce her chest width, and pushed herself through the gap after it. The stone was cold against her back and her sternum as she moved through. Then she was through, and standing at the top of a passage that sloped gently downward into the rock stone walls. Close on both sides, the floor worn smooth by what must have been centuries of water moving through it. The air here was 10 degrees cooler than the canyon floor. The thin trickle of moisture that had crossed the floor above was visible here as a silver thread on the passage floor, a line of water no wider than her finger, catching what light filtered in from the gap behind her. She picked up the satchel. She followed the passage down. 50 feet. The walls widening slightly as she descended the floor. Still smooth, the silver thread of water still ahead of her. The light fading from the entrance behind her, supplemented by nothing. The passage opened into a chamber, and Cora stopped. She stood at the threshold and let her eyes adjust to the dimness, and the chamber assembled itself gradually out of the available light. The faint illumination from the passage behind her, supplemented by thin cracks in the rock above, that let in threads of sunlight in places that the canyon sun reached at this hour. It was not natural. The walls had been cut. She could see the chisel marks even in the poor light, regular overlapping strokes in the sandstone, where someone had worked with iron tools to square the irregular cave into something approaching a right-angled space. The floor had been leveled the natural unevenness of the cave floor ground, or chipped down to a workable surface. Heavy timber braces had been installed along the walls at regular intervals, their bases sunk into holes cut in the floor, their tops fitted against the ceiling to prevent collapse. The wood was old and gray with age, but intact the iron bolts that secured it to the rock orange with rust, but still solid in the stone. Along the walls, arranged with the orderliness of people who expected to return and use what they had stored here, 3 iron-banded chests, each one large enough to require 2 strong men to move their surfaces, furred with the fine gray dust that accumulated in enclosed spaces over years. 4 wooden crates stacked in pairs, their lids fitted but not nailed. 2 canvas-wrapped shapes leaning upright against the far wall, their coverings intact, their contents unknown. And on a flat stone shelf that had been cut directly into the chamber wall at chest height, a small tin lockbox, the kind that households used for documents or for money. Its edges rusted, but its lid still closed. Everything in the chamber was coated in the deep, matte gray of undisturbed dust. The particular dust of a sealed space, fine-grained and comprehensive, the accumulated settling of years, in a room where no air moved and no one came. She stood very still and let the reality of the place settle through her. Then she moved to the nearest chest, worked the hasp old, but it moved and lifted the lid. Gold, not coins bars. Small ones the size of a book, but dense government stamped with the seal of the United States Treasury, their surfaces dulled by the years, but unmistakable. She looked at them for a moment. She set the lid back down. She moved to the crates, working through them methodically. The first held ammunition in paper cartridges, the paper rotted and the contents uncertain. The second held provisions long since spoiled. Rusted tins, rotted fabric, sacking the smell of decay, sealed in and preserved by the dry air until it was more archaeological than organic. The third held documents wrapped in oilcloth, multiple bundles, the wrapping intact. The fourth held what she recognized immediately as surveying equipment. A transit level with its brass fittings, tarnished to dark green, a surveyor's chain coiled and tied with leather cord, a set of drawing instruments in a mahogany case. She opened the mahogany case. Inside, dividers, a ruling pen, 2 pencils worn to short stubs, and in a small pocket on the inside of the lid, a surveying weight, a plumb bob, solid iron turned on a lathe to a precise teardrop shape with a fine brass tip. She lifted it from the pocket and held it in her palm. It was cool and dense, approximately 2 pounds, and it fit her hand exactly as it was designed to fit, as all precisely made tools fit the hands they were made for. She put it in the left pocket of her coat. Not as a weapon, she was not yet thinking in those terms. She put it there because it was her father's kind of tool, and because the habit of pocketing useful things was one he had given her, and because it did not weigh enough to matter, and might at some point matter, in a way she could not yet predict. She came to the tin lockbox last. It was not large, approximately the size of a family Bible, with a simple hasp and a padlock that had rusted to the point where the metal had become one uniform orange-brown surface, the mechanism no longer distinguishable from the housing. She found a piece of iron rod on the chamber floor, the end of a broken tool, probably a cold chisel, and used it to work at the hasp screws, which were rusted in their holes, but not after 10 minutes of careful effort immovable. The hasp came free. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of waxed canvas folded with precision, were two things. The first was a leather-bound ledger. Small the cover, dark with age, the pages visible at the edge of the binding, cream-colored dents filled with writing. She opened it to the first page and read the first line. Accounts of operations Copper Hollow District Red Rock Gang begun. January 1st, 1880, R. Calloway Keeper. She closed it. The second was a single sheet of paper folded twice into quarters, the paper brittle at the edges, but intact, preserved by the waxed canvas against the dry air of the chamber. She unfolded it. She knew the handwriting before she read a word. She had grown up reading it. It was as familiar as the sound of her own name, the specific pressure of the pen on the downstrokes, the way the capital letters sat slightly below the line. He wrote them on as though weighted by their own importance. The small, idiosyncratic habit of putting a period after each number he wrote, as though numbers like sentences required closing. Her father's handwriting. Found the chamber on the 14th. The ledgers are the Red Rock accounts, full, not the partial copy Murtaugh holds. They account for everything. There are names. M knows I've been in the canyon. Do not trust the sheriff. Do not go to the land office without a federal witness. If you are reading this and I am not with you, go to Prescott. Find Briggs. Tell him Calloway kept 2 copies. She read it once. She read it twice. She read it a third time. And on the third reading, she stopped at the second to last line. If you are reading this and I am not with you, and she sat down on the cold stone floor of the chamber and pressed the note against her sternum and looked at the ceiling and understood with the cold and absolute clarity of someone from whom a specific kind of hope has just been permanently removed, that Weston Hartwell had not died of fever. He had been a man who read the land, and had come to this place and had read what it was writing and had understood what that writing meant, and he had gone back to redemption to find a way to bring what he knew to the people who could act on it. And Declan Murtaugh had found out that he had been in the canyon and Weston Hartwell had not reached Prescott. He had died of knowing the truth. He had died of being an honest man in a valley owned by a dishonest one. She sat with this for a long time. The silver thread of water moved along the passage floor behind her patient, and continuous. The cool air of the chamber breathed around her, the particular coolness of stone that has been sealed from the weather long enough to forget what weather feels like. Grief was real, and it was present, and it was going to be with her for a long time. She did not fight it. She let it exist in the space it occupied. And then she looked at what she had, and she thought about what came next. She could not carry the chests. She could not carry the crates. What she could carry was the ledger and the note and the knowledge of where this chamber was and how to reach it, and the piece of iron equipment in her coat pocket. The rest would wait. Stone had been waiting here for years. It could wait longer. She had a damaged rib and a damaged shoulder and no water. She had a way out through a fissure in the rockfall that no one who had thrown her into this canyon knew existed. She had a father's instruction, 6 lines of it Prescott, Briggs. Calloway kept 2 copies. She had enough. She folded her father's note and placed it in the interior breast pocket of her coat against her body, where she would feel it against her skin with every breath. She wrapped the ledger in the oilcloth from the lockbox. She put the ledger in the satchel. She settled the satchel strap across her left shoulder. Then she turned back toward the passage without looking at the chamber again. She had seen it. She had committed it to memory with the same thorough and orderly attention her father had taught her to bring to reading terrain. The memory would serve her better than grief for the next hours, and grief would have to wait its turn. She climbed back up through the passage and squeezed back through the fissure into the canyon, and stood in the afternoon sun with her damaged rib and her bloodied face and her satchel and her note and her ledger and her plumb bob, and she began to look for the way out. August Fenn had not planned to go near Copper Hollow that afternoon. He had a fence line down on the east pasture from the last windstorm, 3 posts pulled from the ground, the wire sagging between the ones that remained, and 3 head of cattle missing from the morning count, which had sent him east and then south following tracks in the dust that were still fresh enough to be read. He had a water trough at the south windmill that needed a new supply fitting at the joint, where the pipe connected to the tank, which he had been meaning to replace for 2 weeks, and which leaked a gallon an hour, that he could not spare in July. These were the ordinary tasks of an ordinary day on a ranch that had been built for 2 people and was now the sole occupation of one. Eleanor had been gone for 14 months. Not gone in the way that people use the word when they are being kind to themselves about it. Gone in the specific and irreversible way that left a hole in the fabric of every day, where she had been, which was everywhere. She had been present in the ranch in the particular way that people who have built something are present in what they built, in the placement of the furniture, in the arrangement of the kitchen shelves in the garden. She had planted along the south wall of the cabin in the first spring, after they arrived, which still bloomed in the spring without her tending it faithful and heartbreaking. In the ledger she had kept on the kitchen table, the accounts of the ranch in her careful handwriting, which he still added to every week because he did not know where else to put the numbers, and because the act of continuing her record felt on some level he could not articulate like a form of respect for the continuity of things. He did not go to town if he could help it. Redemption had been Eleanor's death sentence delivered by a physician who had told his rider that he would come when he had a break in his schedule, and had arrived on the 4th day, by which time the fever had done what unchecked fever does in the summer heat of Arizona. He had charged $4 for the visit and expressed his regrets and ridden back to town. He had put new glass windows in his office 2 years ago. The doctor, August had noticed, a practice the size of Amos Vetch's practice in a town the size of Redemption did not generate the kind of income that went into new glass windows and new millwork on the door frame and a new leather-upholstered examination chair that August had seen through the open door on the one occasion in the past year when he had been in town for supplies and had walked past the office. He had noticed and filed it the way a man of ranching habits files observations about things that don't add up without yet having a category to file them in. He tracked the cattle east, then south, into the broken country, where the desert flats gave way to the canyon geography, the ground rising in shallow steps and then dropping into the cuts and draws that eventually reached Copper Hollow. He had no intention of going to the trestle. He never went to the trestle. The trestle was a place of local legend and grim utility. Everyone in the canyon country knew that the Devil's Jaw, which was what some people called Copper Hollow, was a place where things that went in did not come out. Lost cattle occasionally, foolish prospectors twice in August's memory, people the land selected for removal. He was following the cattle tracks around a long curve in the terrain when Gideon stopped. The old gelding was not a nervous horse. 20 years of working the broken country of the Arizona range had made him steady and deliberate, the kind of horse that read terrain with his feet and ears and made his own assessments rather than waiting to be told. He did not spook at snakes or sudden movements or the shadows of hawks. When he stopped of his own accord and raised his head and blew out a long, slow breath through his nose and fixed his gaze on a specific point ahead and slightly below, August trusted it completely. He dismounted at the canyon rim. The canyon fell away 90 feet below him, the floor in shadow at this hour, the trestle casting its long diagonal darkness across the pale rock. He looked for what Gideon had seen, and it took him a moment. She was moving, slowly and in short steps, that spoke of pain being carefully managed. Her right arm held close to her body, and her left doing the work of balance but moving, working along the base of the south wall toward the rock fall at the canyon's far end. A woman, young in a canvas coat and a split skirt that had taken the brunt of whatever had brought her to the canyon floor. He looked at the rim where she would have come from. He looked at the walls. He looked at her again. Then he went to find the way down. There was only one, and it was not a path in any guidebook sense of the word. It was a sequence of ledges and cracks and holds he had discovered in his second year on the ranch, when a young heifer had gone over the rim at precisely this spot, and he had gone down to retrieve her by hand, a 2-hour process that had convinced him never to run cattle within 50 yards of the rim again, and that had also, incidentally, given him the knowledge of how to descend a wall that looked from the top like there was no way down. The descent took him 12 minutes. He moved without haste, because haste on that kind of terrain was how men acquired injuries that cost them weeks of work, and an injury right now would help no one. He found her at the base of the rock fall, sitting against a boulder. Not fallen, the posture was deliberate. Upright, her satchel on her lap with both hands resting on it. The gash on her cheekbone had dried in the heat and cracked slightly when the skin moved, and the bruising under it was already developing a deep purple red that was going to be striking by morning. Her breathing was shallow and controlled, the particular discipline of someone managing significant pain through a conscious act of will. She heard him on the rock before she saw him. She looked up before he was fully visible, which told him her hearing was intact and her reflexes were working, which were the two things that most directly mattered in the immediate term. Her eyes were brown and entirely alert. Whatever the rest of her was dealing with, her eyes were operating at full capacity. He unslung his canteen. He did not speak because there was nothing useful to say in the first moment, and she did not look like a woman who needed words before water. He uncorked it and held it out. She took it. She drank 4 swallows, measured, not desperate, the careful intake of someone who understood physiology well enough to know that too much too fast was its own problem. She handed the canteen back. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. He found that more remarkable than he was going to say. August Fenn, ranch north of here. Cora Hartwell. She said it with a particular flatness, the name, as a stated fact rather than an introduction. "I need to get out of this canyon." He looked at her right side, the way she was holding the arm, the way she was breathing. "It's not an easy climb. Neither is staying." He could not argue with that. He extended his left hand. She was right-handed, but her right side was compromised, and she would understand the geometry without explanation. She took it, and he helped her to her feet, and she came up steadily, which told him about the kind of reserves she was working from. They stood at the base of the rock fall in the shadow of the canyon, the trestle making its sound above them. "My father filed a land claim here," she said. "Weston Hartwell. It's in the land office. If anything happens to me, there's a record." He looked at her. "Nothing is going to happen to you." "No," she said, and said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has made a decision that she is finished revising. "I'm going to make sure of it myself." The climb was what it was. He went first and she followed, and he went slowly because the holds were subtle, and the consequences of a missed one were not, and she was working with one arm. She did not complain or ask for time. She moved from one hold to the next with a focus that was entirely inward, all her available energy going into the next placement of foot or hand. None of it sparing a thought for anything else. They reached the top and stood in the full heat of the afternoon sun, which after 90 feet of shade felt like walking into something solid. Gideon turned his head toward them and blew out a long, patient breath, as though he had expected them and had simply been waiting for them to catch up. Auguste helped her onto the saddle. As he mounted behind her to steady her for the ride, his eyes went to the satchel she was still carrying on her left side, had carried throughout the climb, throughout everything, holding it with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the broken strap and everything to do with what was inside. He did not ask. He turned Gideon north, and they rode toward the ranch, and the sun behind them moved toward the western ridges, and the shadow of the Cathedral of Bones stretched long and gray across the canyon floor below, and the wind moved through the old gray timber of the trestle and made the sound it always made, low and resonant and patient, like a bell struck softly in a large and empty room. He had her at the ranch before sundown. She was unconscious by the time he got her off the horse, going out between one breath and the next, in the way that the body sometimes enforces what the will refuses. He carried her inside, which was easier than he had expected. She was light in the specific way of a person who has been burning more calories than they have been consuming for a sustained period, the lightness of depletion rather than smallness. He cleaned the gash on her cheekbone with clean water and carbolic solution, working carefully because the cut was close to the cheekbone and the skin there bruised easily, and he did not want to add to the damage. He wrapped the rib cage as tightly as he judged safe, firm enough to provide support, not so tight as to compromise breathing, which was more important than comfort. He kept the lamp low and the windows open for cross-ventilation, and replaced the water at her bedside twice a day, and he sat by the fire in the evenings and listened to her breathe, and tried not to let his mind go to Eleanor in the last days, which was what his mind wanted to do, and which he was not going to allow it. On the second night, she said a name in her sleep, Myrta. He sat completely still when she said it. He waited. On the third afternoon, she said in a clear and urgent voice that was not the voice of a sleeping person, but of someone moving through something urgent in a place that existed parallel to sleep the ledgers. They're in the stone, both copies. He said nothing. He replaced the cloth on her forehead with a cooler one, and he sat with what she had said, and he thought about Declan Murtaugh, whom he had never confronted because confronting Murtaugh was the kind of thing a man did when he was prepared to absorb what came after, and August had not, in the 14 months since Eleanor, been a man with enough in reserve for that kind of commitment. And he thought about the doctor's new windows, and he thought about a dead surveyor whose daughter had come to collect his claim and had ended up at the bottom of Copper Hollow with a broken rib and classified information about ledgers hidden in stone. On the fourth morning, Cora Hartwell opened her eyes fully and stayed awake. He was at the window. He heard the change in her breathing, the shift from the slow, autonomous rhythm of unconscious sleep to the quicker, more deliberate pattern of returning awareness. And he turned. She looked at the ceiling, at the walls, at the window and the morning outside it, at him. "How long?" she said. 4 days. She processed this. Then, my satchel. Under the cot. I didn't go through it. She held his gaze for several seconds with the steady assessment of someone taking the measure of a situation before committing to a response. Then she said, "Declan Murtaugh pushed me into Copper Hollow. He took my father's claim papers and he pushed me off the canyon rim." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know. I know you didn't fall. Nobody falls into the jaw and ends up that deep in the canyon. You end up at the base of the wall where you came off the rim." He came to the chair and sat. "You were near the rockfall, which is 70 yards from any point on the rim." He paused. "I also know you survived something you were not supposed to survive, and that you came out of that canyon holding a satchel like it was the most important thing you owned." "It is," she said. "Then I'd like you to tell me what's in it." She pulled herself carefully upright, working with her left arm. She reached under the cot and found the satchel by feel and set it on the blanket in her lap. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you what I found at the bottom of that canyon. All of it." He pulled the chair to the bedside. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything. She told it the way her father had taught her to write a survey report in sequence, with precision, without interpretive overlay. The shove and the fall, the rib and the shoulder, the canyon floor, and the color of the soil at the base of the trestle pier. Her father's voice, the driest ground remembers the deepest water. The gradient she had tracked on her hands and knees, the fissure behind the rockfall, the passage, the chamber. August listened without movement, without interruption. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his eyes on her face, and he let her tell it in the order it had happened, which was the order that made it true. When she finished, she removed the ledger from the satchel and set it on the blanket. She removed the note and held it in her left hand. He looked at the ledger. Red Rock Gang accounts. Reuben Calloway's ledger. Full accounts, not the partial copy Murtaugh already has. She held up the note. My father's handwriting. He found the chamber before me. He understood what the ledger was. August reached for the note. She handed it to him. He read it. He read it again. Reuben Calloway, he said, handing the note back to her. The name carried something not surprise, but recognition of a specific weight that had been attached to the name for a long time. Red Rock Gang, 10 years ago or thereabouts. 3 years of payroll robberies and rustled cattle through the canyon country. Then a posse rode into Broken Spur Pass, and that was the end of them. He paused. Murtaugh led the posse. He was celebrated for it. Town council the following autumn. Bank the spring after that. He built everything on what he did in that pass, Cora said. And the ledger is the record of everything he was doing before it. August stood and went to the window. He looked at the land south of the ranch, the flat country, the mesa in the middle. Distance, the line of the canyon country beyond where the trestle would be invisible from this distance, but present. He had looked at that southern view 14 months ago and thought Eleanor would have liked this view in the mornings. He had not thought it since. He thought it now. Eleanor got sick in the fall of '87, he said. Bad fever. I sent a rider for the doctor the first morning. The doctor sent word he'd come when he had a break in his schedule. He did not inflect the words. He recited them the way you recite. A thing you have turned over enough times that it has worn smooth. He came on the 4th day. He said there was nothing to be done. He charged $4 and rode back to town. He was quiet for a moment. 2 years ago, his office got new windows, new millwork, new chair I saw through the door. A practice his size doesn't generate that kind of income. His name is in the ledger, Cora said. Page 7, Dr. Amos Vetch. August turned from the window. You read it. Enough. The first 20 pages in the chamber before I left. She held his gaze steadily. The doctor, the sheriff, 3 council members, dates and amounts going back to 1880, and Murtaugh's name starting on page 19 and appearing through the rest of the book, not as a recipient of payments, but as the organizer. The one who designed the system. August came back to the chair and sat. He was very still, the way a person is still, when the information they are absorbing is not new in its essence, but is new in its specificity, when a suspicion they have lived with long enough to accept as unfounded is revealed to be, after all, exact. Your father found this, he said, and went back to redemption, and Murtaugh found out he'd been in the canyon. Yes. And your father is dead. Yes. Auguste looked at the ledger on the blanket. Then he looked at her. When you're strong enough to ride, he said, you show me. She was strong enough in 3 more days. The rib had settled into a managed ache. The shoulder moved at cost. The gash on her cheekbone had closed, and the bruising had gone through its progression of colors and was settling into the yellow-green of the final stage. She had eaten what he brought her and slept when she needed to and spent the waking hours in the cabin working through the ledger. She had brought it inside from the satchel on the second day and read it in full, making notes in the margins of a notebook she found on the kitchen shelf, cross-referencing dates and amounts and names against each other with the methodical care of someone who understood that the value of a document was not in its assertions but in the relationships between its entries. On the morning of the 7th day, she was on the porch in the early light when Auguste came out and found her there with the notebook and the ledger and a cup of coffee she had made herself on the kitchen stove. "Today," she said. He nodded. They rode south in the early morning, the best time before the heat built and the light flattened, and the world reduced itself to glare and endurance. Auguste on Gideon Cora, on a mare named Patience, who had a smooth ground-covering walk that didn't jolt the rib unnecessarily. They didn't speak much. There was a kind of conversation available between people who are moving toward the same thing, with the same understanding, conducted in silence, and in the shared attention they gave to the land around them. When the trestle appeared above the canyon rim, Cora felt the same thing she had felt. The first time the sound, before the sight, the low vibration in the sternum that preceded the visual, by long enough to be processed as something separate. Beside her, she heard Auguste draw a slow breath. "Lord," he said quietly. "I know," she said. They tethered the horses in a shallow alcove where the rim curved back, and a stand of mesquite provided cover against observation from the canyon walls. Auguste brought the rifle, a lantern rope, and a short-handled pry bar. He had also brought, without being asked, a second canteen, which he handed to Cora without comment. She led him to the fissure. He looked at it, the angle of the fallen slab, the gap behind it, the way the cool air breathed from within, with the focused attention of a man who was updating his understanding of something. He did not comment. He simply turned sideways the way she had and went through. She followed him into the passage and down and into the chamber. He stood at the threshold and lifted the lantern slowly, letting the warm light move across the space. And his face in that light was the face of a man whose available categories for experience have just been challenged by something that does not fit inside them. "Nobody has been here since your father," he said. "No." They opened the lockbox tin together, though Cora already knew what was inside, and Auguste was already coming to understand. She showed him the note again in the lantern light, and he read it in context now, in the chamber it described with the ledger it referenced on the stone shelf in front of them. Then they went to work. She set the ledger on the flat stone shelf and opened it to the first page, and Auguste brought the lantern close, and they read. It was slow work. The handwriting was Calloway's, cramped and dense, the hand of a man who had learned to write in the margin of necessity rather than in the luxury of education, who compressed his letters and eliminated unnecessary flourishes because he was always writing in conditions where ink and paper were limited. But it was legible and it was organized, and Cora had spent enough time with it in the previous 3 days to have developed a working fluency. She read aloud, and Auguste listened, and when names appeared that he recognized, his recognition showed in the stillness that settled over him the particular quality of a man absorbing a confirmation of something he had feared was true. Dr. Amos Vetch, page 7. Payments beginning spring 1880 quarterly, in amounts that were individually modest and collectively significant. The service rendered information, which coaches were carrying payroll, which roads were being used for which shipments, which passengers might be carrying valuables, and which might be armed. The doctor's access to the town's commercial and social information had made him in the system Calloway described a highly effective intelligence source. Auguste said nothing when they reached Vetch's name. He pressed his lips together slightly, and that was all. Sheriff Burl Endon, page 12. Larger payments less frequent. The ledger's notation was brief and precise. Blind Eye Canyon Road, September 81. And the same entry with updated dates 5 more times through the following 18 months. The sheriff's role in the system was the simplest: to not look at what was happening on the roads south of town, and to not investigate the things that happened there. The 3 council members, Clement Hasker Druitt Farnham, Abe Salter. Their names appeared together on page 15, their payments structured differently from the others, not for information or for inaction, but for what the ledger termed facilitation. Hasker had been on the county commission when a railway right-of-way question that should have blocked the trestle's construction had been resolved in the company's favor. Farnham had been the notary who authenticated documents that did not deserve authentication. Salter had owned the livery that had provided horses to the gang for 4 separate operations without reporting the rentals. All of them had been paid. All of them were still in redemption in their positions, living on what the payment had built for them. And then, beginning on page 19, and running through the rest of the ledger with the frequency and prominence of a structural element, the name that organized everything else, Declan Murtaugh, not as a recipient of payments, as the architect. The ledger's entries beside Murtaugh's name were different in character from all the others. Not ledger entries in the strict accounting sense, but operational notes, records of conversations and agreements, the specific plans and routes and timings that Murtaugh had contributed to the enterprise. He had not been an accessory to an operation that existed independently of him. He had created it. He had found Calloway already a mid-level criminal operating out of New Mexico territory with a small gang and no particular infrastructure, and had offered him something worth more than any individual score. Organization, local knowledge, legitimate cover and protection from the law that he himself controlled. He had offered Calloway the Canyon Country, which he knew in the detail of someone who had been speculating on land claims in the area for 2 years, and who had surveyed its geography with the eye of a man planning to use it rather than simply to own it. He had offered him the blind sheriff and the cooperative doctor and the notary and the livery owner. He had offered him, in short, a professional criminal infrastructure operating inside a legitimate community, which was worth more than anything Calloway had ever been able to put together on his own. In exchange, the majority of the proceeds from every operation the Red Rock Gang ran through the Copper Hollow country for 3 years. He recruited them, Cora said. She had reached the final section of the ledger where the handwriting compressed, still further the entries coming closer together, the tone shifting from accounting to something more urgent. Calloway was already an outlaw. Murtaugh gave him a structure, made him professional. August was very still. "The final job," he said, She read carefully. Spring of 1882. A federal payroll shipment full U.S. Army escort moving through the territory. Murtaugh had a contact in the Army Supply Office who told him the route and the timing and the size of the escort. She moved her finger along the line. The plan was the biggest thing the gang had ever attempted, bigger than anything most criminal operations in the territory had ever attempted. She turned to the final pages. The handwriting here was the most compressed, the most pressured. The ink varied in intensity line by line, as though the writer had been working by poor light or in a state of urgency that affected the pressure of the pen. "He promised them pardons," she said. August looked at her. Full pardons, new identities, safe passage out of the territory. She read the ledger's account of the arrangement, which was Calloway's own record, set down with the meticulous detail of a man who had entered into a significant agreement and wanted a record of its terms. In exchange for the gang turning over their ledger, the full accounting of every crime, every name, every transaction, Murtaugh would arrange federal pardons and guarantee their safety. The gang gets a clean start. Murtaugh gets the evidence that could destroy him and everyone associated with him, and he keeps the gold. She read to the end of the section. They handed over the primary ledger, she said. Calloway's account of the handover, a moonless night. Murtaugh in person, the pardon papers signed and sealed, with what appeared to be a federal seal, the ledger in a leather case. Both parties satisfied. She paused. The pardon papers were forgeries. The seal was produced by the same notary who had been falsifying documents for the gang's operations for 3 years. The next morning, instead of guides to safety, a posse arrived at Broken Spur Pass. August was completely still. Murtaugh led it, Cora said. He rode out in the night, positioned his men, and then led the posse in the morning. The posse he told the town about, the one that made him a hero. She closed the ledger. He killed them, took the gold, both the gang's accumulated share and the federal payroll, and collected the bounty on the bodies. Then he buried the story and built a bank. She put her hand flat on the cover of the ledger. Calloway survived, she said. He was wounded, but he made it to the canyon. He made it here. He had this copy, the second ledger, the one he had never mentioned to Murtaugh. The insurance he had kept back from the beginning. She looked at August. He hid it here with the gold. He had also kept back the portion of the gang's take he had never disclosed to Murtaugh. He wrote letters. She reached into the satchel and produced the oilcloth bundle from the document crate, which she had carried alongside the ledger throughout her days in the cabin. And then he died here or somewhere near here. His body was never found. She set the oilcloth bundle on the stone shelf and unwrapped it. Inside 2 thick packets of letters tied with leather cord. The paper ivory with age, the ink faded but legible. "He wrote about my father," she said. She had read the letters in the cabin by candlelight over 3 evenings that had left her with a specific understanding of what her father had been and what had been done to him. In the last letters, a man who came to find him, a surveyor, he writes, she found the page. I told him everything. He was the only man I met in that valley who listened without wanting something from the listening. I hope his daughter, if he has one, never comes looking." She folded the letter and replaced it. August looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze steadily and waited. "Your father was trying to get to Prescott," August said. "Yes?" "And Murtaugh's men caught up with him before he could." "Yes." The silence in the chamber was the particular silence of two people who have arrived at a shared understanding of something large and irreversible. The cool air moved around them. The lantern burned. The thin thread of water moved along the passage floor with its continuous, indifferent patience. August straightened. He looked around the chamber. The chests, the crates, the letters, the ledger, 10 years of evidence sitting in the cool dark of a space that no one had found in a decade. "We can't carry the gold," he said. "We don't need to. We need the ledger and the letters and a witness." He was thinking in the practical register of a man who had been solving logistical problems alone for a long time. There has to be someone in Redemption who has been watching this and hasn't been able to speak because there was no one safe to speak to. Cora thought about the faces she had seen in the town, the clerk's careful neutralizing, the women on the boardwalk who had watched her walk past without warmth but without the specific coldness of Murtaugh's circle either. The texture of a community that had learned to be very still. "There's someone," she said. "I don't know who yet, but there is someone." She was right. The person's name was Orvilla Peck, and she found them before they had to find her. It happened on the 5th day after the visit to the chamber in the late afternoon. Cora was on the porch of the ranch cabin working through the ledger for the 3rd time and building a comprehensive written summary of its contents in the back pages of the notebook she had found in August's kitchen. She was doing this because her father had taught her that a single copy of anything important was functionally the same as no copy, a principle that had served the survey work well in the field where original documents could be lost to weather or accident, and that applied with even greater force here. She was writing the summary in her own hand, cross-referenced to the ledger by page number, organized by name and date. If something happened to the ledger, the summary would survive. If something happened to the summary, the ledger would survive. They would not be kept together. That was the whole point. She heard the horse before she saw the rider coming in from the direction of the eastern road. At a walk, unhurried, direct the approach of someone who had decided to come here and was arriving without ambiguity. The woman who rode into the yard was somewhere in her middle 60s, small-framed and upright in the saddle with the undemonstrative posture of someone who had been riding for 50 years and had stopped thinking about it as a physical act and started thinking about it as simply the way the body moved through the landscape. She wore a dark, practical dress and a wide-brimmed hat, and she rode a dun horse that covered ground with the easy efficiency of an animal in good condition and well cared for. She stopped at the yard fence and looked at Cora on the porch with brown eyes that were sharp and entirely unafraid. "You're Weston Hartwell's girl," she said. "Not a question. Cora Hartwell. Orvilla Peck. I have a homestead 8 miles northeast of here. I've been watching Declan Murtaugh run this valley for the better part of a decade." She dismounted and tied the dun to the fence post and came through the gate with the economical movement of a woman who did not waste steps. "I heard your name in town 3 days ago, along with the information that you'd gone into Copper Hollow and were presumed dead. I rode out here because August Fenn is the only man in this part of the territory I trust to have done the right thing if he'd found you. August had come from the direction of the water trough and was standing at the yard fence listening. "Come inside," Cora said. "There's water and coffee, and I need to hear everything you know." Orvilla Peck had arrived on the homestead northeast of Redemption in 1875, when her husband Clarence had filed the land claim and built the house and established the small cattle operation that had outlasted him by 17 years. Clarence had died in 77, a snake bite. The worst kind of luck in the most practical sense, a man in good health dead in 2 days for the most random of reasons. Orvilla had buried him and continued the work because the alternative was to leave something they had built together, and she was not prepared to do that. She had run the homestead alone since then, and she had learned in those 17 years the specific skills of a woman who depends on her own observation and her own judgment for everything, because there is no one else to depend on. She had watched Murtaugh's rise with the attention that comes from proximity and from the particular acuity of someone who has nothing to lose from seeing clearly. She sat at August's kitchen table with her hands folded and spoke in the measured tone of a person reciting something they have rehearsed many times in their own mind, which is what people do with things they have been waiting to say for a long time. "April of 1882, she said. "I was coming back from my sister's place in Tucson. It was late past midnight. I'd come off the main road onto Canyon Road because my mule had thrown a shoe and the main road surface was too hard on the bare hoof. Canyon Road is softer. No moon that night." She paused. "I saw riders," she said, "6 of them coming from the south at speed, from the direction of Broken Spur Pass. I pulled off into the brush and waited. They came past close enough that I could see faces when their horses moved into a patch of clearer dark." She looked at the table. "Declan Murtaugh, Sheriff Endon. 2 men I knew from town by sight, 2 I didn't recognize. Murtaugh had a canvas bag across his saddle held in both hands, and he was riding like a man who had just done something large and was not finished yet. That was the night before the official posse rode out," Cora said. "The next morning, Murtaugh came back into town with 12 men and said they'd located the Red Rock camp and ridden out in the night, and the gang was dead." Orvilla's voice stayed even. "There was a celebration that evening. The saloon bought a round for the whole town. Within the month, Murtaugh was on the town council. Within the year, the bank was under construction. You saw him leaving the pass before the official account says he went," August said. "I saw him leaving the pass at midnight with a canvas bag returning to town, and then going out again in the morning with a larger party to discover what he had already done." She looked up. "I knew what I'd seen. I understood that it meant something. What I didn't fully understand was the scope of it. What I understood was that when I thought about going to the sheriff, I remembered that the sheriff had been one of the riders." "Why not the federal authorities?" Cora asked. "No proof. And the one time I mentioned it to a merchant in town, a man I'd known for years, he came to my homestead 2 weeks later and told me very quietly and very clearly that I would be better served by keeping my own counsel." She met Cora's gaze without flinching. "I have a homestead. I have cattle. I have lived alone there for 17 years, and I have no family within 300 miles. I made a calculation. I understand the calculation, Cora said. Your father came to see me, Orvila said. In March, before he died. He had been working in the canyon country on survey work, he said, and he had found something he didn't say what specifically. He asked me if I had seen anything unusual in the spring of 1882. She paused. I told him what I just told you. Cora was very still. He said he was going to Prescott, Orvila said. That he had enough, that I might be asked to give a formal statement to the U.S. Marshal there, and that he hoped I would agree to do it. She looked at her hands. I said I would. I meant it. Another pause longer. 6 weeks later, I heard in town that Weston Hartwell had died of fever. The word fever in her mouth had the same quality it had in Cora's own. Not a medical term, but a word used in the place of a truth that could not yet be spoken safely. I want to give that statement, Orvila said. I've wanted to give it since the night I pulled off the road and waited in the dark. I've been waiting for something sufficient to make it possible. She looked at Cora with the expression of a woman who has been doing complex calculations about risk and possibility for a long time and has arrived finally at a figure she can commit to. You're sufficient. They were at the kitchen table discussing the route to Prescott, how many days, which roads, whether to go through or around Redemption, what they would need for the journey when Dross found them. He had not found the chamber. Cora was certain of that, reading the situation backward from what she knew of his skills and what she knew he had been looking for. What he had found were the tracks of 2 horses making the same circuit south from the ranch toward the canyon country, then north again. For a man trained as a tracker, this was information. 2 horses making the same round trip to a location he had not seen them reach on behalf of a woman who was supposed to be dead at the bottom of a canyon. This was more than information. This was a problem that required immediate attention. The storm announced itself first. The way monsoon storms in Arizona announce themselves not gradually, but with the compressed urgency of a weather system that has made up its mind. The southwestern sky had been changing color for 40 minutes, the blue going yellow-green at the horizon, in the specific way that experienced desert dwellers recognized as a precursor not to rain, but to what came before rain. Wind, then darkness, then the sky opening all at once. They were in the chamber when it hit. Cora had wanted to retrieve the remaining oilcloth-wrapped document bundles she had left in the crate on the first visit. The secondary correspondence, the letters that supplemented and corroborated the ledger. She had come back for them with August because completeness was the point. Orvila had stayed at the ranch. The rain hit the canyon above them with the sound of something structural giving way, a wall of water dropping onto stone. The drumming of it transmitted through 90 feet of sandstone into the chamber floor as a low, sustained vibration. Within minutes, the volume in the canyon above them increased exponentially as every drainage on the surrounding mesa funneled its contribution into the canyon floor, and the flash flood began its rapid and total transformation of the landscape. They could not use the passage, not with that volume of water running. The passage was a funnel that would channel the flood directly into the chamber and fill it. Auguste moved to block the passage opening with the canvas-wrapped shapes from against the far wall, not to seal it, which was impossible, but to slow whatever water came through long enough to matter. Cora was at the stone shelf, the ledger already in the satchel, the document bundle in her hands when the shadow appeared at the passage entrance. He had come through the flood. His hat was somewhere in the canyon. Water ran from his hair and his coat and pooled on the passage floor around his feet. His eyes took less than 2 seconds to move across the chamber. The chests, the crates, the lantern, Auguste and Cora, and the inventory was complete. He smiled. It was a thin expression, practiced and efficient, the smile of a man for whom this kind of situation was professional rather than personal. "Dross," Auguste said. "Mr. Fenn." His voice was conversational. His hand was moving toward the iron at his hip with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who knows he is in control of the pace. "Miss Hartwell, the boss had a feeling you weren't as dead as he left you." The lantern was on the stone shelf between Cora and the passage entrance. She looked at it. She looked at the chamber. She had been in this space 3 times now, and she had the spatial memory of her father's daughter. Not memorized so much as internalized the dimensions and the contents mapped in the same way she mapped terrain, as a set of relationships between positions rather than as a list of facts. She did not move toward Dross. She moved to the lantern and turned the wick down to its lowest functional setting, reducing the flame to a thread of blue light and dropping the chamber from illuminated to nearly dark. The only remaining light was the faint gray seep from the passage entrance, barely sufficient to distinguish shapes at arm's length. Dross fired. The muzzle flash was enormous in the enclosed space, a single white detonation that imposed its afterimage on the darkness and filled the chamber with the sharp double smell of black powder and hot metal. The shot struck stone to her left, the ricochet, singing off into the dark. Auguste moved. She heard it the specific acoustic signature of 2 people making physical contact in a confined space, the grunt of impact, the scrape of boot soles on stone, the sound of a body hitting the chamber wall hard enough to feel through the floor. She did not move toward them. She pressed herself against the far wall and moved laterally along it, her left hand trailing the surface until her fingers found the edge of the stone shelf. The plumb bob was there. She had put it on the shelf when she removed the ledger, in the way she put things in specific places so that she could find them without seeing them, the habit of a person who had spent years in survey camps where organization was survival. She closed her hand around it. The fight between Auguste and Dross moved in the dark by sound. She tracked it with the focus of someone who has learned that attention is a tool as useful as any physical one. They crashed against the crates, a heavy sound, multiple objects displaced. Something fell from the stone shelf. They moved back toward the passage entrance, toward the gray light, and in that marginal illumination she could see shapes but not features. She moved by sound. She moved with the deliberateness her father had taught her. In difficult survey terrain, no step committed until the next one was identified, all movement purposeful. She was close enough when she swung, close enough that she did not need to see, only to listen, and to time the arc of her arm against the specific acoustic information the struggle was providing. The plumb bob, dense and precisely weighted, traveled a short arc and connected with a solid, final-sounding impact. Dross went down. The chamber went quiet except for August's breathing, controlled, deliberate. The breathing of a man managing the aftermath of significant physical effort and the sound of the flood running in the canyon above. She turned the lantern wick back up. Dross was on the chamber floor, unconscious, a gash above his left ear, where the iron had found its mark. August was standing over him, his left hand pressed to a cut on his right forearm, where a knife had opened the skin during the struggle. He was already tearing a strip from the hem of his shirt to bind it, moving with the efficient self-repair of a man accustomed to managing his own injuries in the field. Cora looked at what she had done with the steady assessment of someone who has arrived on the other side of an action they had not known they would be called to take, and has discovered that they are still standing and still functional. "He's alive," she said. "Yes. We need him alive. He's our witness," August said. "He was present in the land office when Murtaugh ordered Dross to take you to the canyon. He watched Murtaugh push you off the rim." He finished tying the strip of shirt around his arm and tested the tightness. "He's also the only person who knows exactly what Murtaugh sent him here to do, which gives us something current and specific to give Briggs, not just a 10-year-old conspiracy that Murtaugh can try to discredit." They bound Dross with leather straps from August's saddlebag wrists to ankles tight enough to hold and loose enough not to compromise circulation. They waited out the flood. The sound of water in the canyon above diminished gradually over 3 hours as the drainage from the surrounding mesa worked through the system and the volume in the canyon floor dropped. When the sound had diminished enough that the passage was likely passable, Cora checked it. The floor was wet and the walls were wet, but the water was ankle-deep at most, and moving rather than rising. They emerged into a canyon transformed by the monsoon, the floor washed clean, the sandstone walls darkened with moisture, the air carrying the specific smell of Arizona, after rain, mineral and clean, and briefly cool, the smell of a landscape that has received something it does not often get, and is making efficient use of it before the heat returns. The trestle above them was darker than usual, the old timber saturated by the rain, and the sound it made in the post-storm wind was different. Lower, wetter, the resonance of saturated wood, a deeper note than its usual dry air tone. Cora stood at the base of the main pier and looked up. The pier's base had been scoured by the flood, the darker soil temporarily washed away to reveal the pale stone beneath. She knew where the soil would reappear when the dust settled and the moisture worked its way back to the surface. She knew the passage behind the rockfall. She knew the chamber. She knew the ledger in her satchel and the letters and her father's note and the plumb bob in her pocket and what all of it meant. August came to stand beside her. Dross was propped against the canyon wall, conscious now, watching them, with the wary and recalculating attention of a man reassessing a situation he had entered with certainty and was now leaving with a great deal of uncertainty. "Prescott," August said. "Tomorrow morning, first light," Cora said. "We go back to the ranch tonight, tell Orvila, and we leave before dawn." She looked at the pier one more time, at the base of it where the water came from. at the structure above her that her father had understood before anyone else thought to look at it. Then she turned and walked toward the path up the canyon wall, and August followed, and Dross was helped to his feet and made to walk between them and the trestle. Above them made its low and resonant sound in the evening wind, and the canyon began to fill with shadow, and the stars appeared in sequence above the narrow strip of sky between the rim walls. She had the ledger, she had the letters, she had her father's note. She had a written summary of the ledger's contents, made in her own hand, which she would keep separately from the original. She had Orvilla's eyewitness account of the midnight riders at Broken Spur Pass. She had Dross, who had been present when Murtagh gave the order, and who was now in the specific position of a man who understood that his employer would sacrifice him without a second thought, and who was going to have to choose whose protection was more reliable. She had enough. Her father had believed it was enough, and he had been right. He had simply not had time to deliver it. She was going to deliver it. They left before dawn. The desert in the hour before sunrise was a different world from the one it became cooler by 30 degrees, the air carrying the faint mineral sweetness that burned off by 7. The sky a gradual transition from the deep black of full night through the purple of pre-dawn to the first pale band of lighter color at the eastern horizon. The 4 of them rode out of August's yard in that pre-dawn purple, moving at a steady walk, not slow, but not urgent. The pace of people who understood that they needed to cover distance without attracting attention, and that these 2 requirements were best met by looking like people going about ordinary business. Cora on patience, August on Gideon, Orvilla on her dun horse, straight-backed and alert in the saddle, carrying the particular composure of someone who has made a significant decision and has moved past the anxiety of making it into the clarity of acting on it. And Dross on a spare horse from August's string, his wrists bound to the saddle horn with a leather strap that left him sufficient movement for balance and none for anything else. He had not spoken since the canyon. He rode with his eyes forward and his expression closed, the face of a man running calculations on a situation that had moved far outside the parameters he had been hired to manage. They skirted Redemption to the east, following a route August knew from years of moving cattle, a series of track roads and livestock paths that added 4 miles to the journey, but kept them off the main road south of town and away from the observation points that a man with Murtagh's resources and paranoia would have put eyes on by this point. Murtagh knew Dross was missing. He would be calculating. The sun cleared the eastern ridge as they moved into the open country north of the canyon lands, and the morning light came across the desert in its long, flat, early-hour way, making the creosote and the brittle bush and the scattered cholla briefly incandescent before settling into the ordinary hard illumination of an Arizona morning. The light in this country at this hour had a quality that Cora had come to understand over the weeks she had been here. Not beauty in the comfortable sense, but the specific beauty of a thing that demands something from the viewer and offers something back to those willing to pay attention. She rode and thought. She thought about Marshall Tatum Briggs, whose name her father had written as the 6th and final line of the most important document he had ever composed. She knew the name from the territorial papers she had read over 2 years of following her father's work, accounts of prosecutions, land fraud investigations, the systematic dismantling of several extra-legal arrangements that had been operating in the territory under the cover of legitimate business. Briggs had a reputation that was specific enough to be credible, not celebrated, not politically visible, but consistently effective at the particular kind of work that required patience and precision rather than speed and visibility. He was known to be difficult. He was known to verify everything himself. He was known to have walked away from cases that would have made careers rather than build on foundations he considered insufficient. These were exactly the qualities she needed. "Tell me about Briggs," she said to August during a flat stretch where they could ride two abreast. August told her what he knew: the land fraud investigation 7 years ago, the 2 quiet days of questioning the departure without arrests, the rancher named Pollard, whose deed irregularities had been quietly corrected 6 months after Briggs's visit, without any public acknowledgement of how it had happened. The quote Pollard had attributed to Briggs: "I can't build what I can't finish, but I can remove the pieces they think they've secured." "Patient," Cora said. "He doesn't move until the foundation is right." "That's the word for it. Then we need to give him a foundation he can build on." She had been working through the architecture of her presentation for 2 days, identifying the weak points. The way she identified weak points in a survey, the places where the terrain would not support what was being placed on it. The ledger alone is not enough. Murtaugh's defense will be that Calloway fabricated it, that a dead outlaw tried to implicate a legitimate businessman as posthumous revenge for whatever grievance the outlaw imagined. "Orvilla," August said. "She places Murtaugh at the pass before the official account says he went. That's independent corroboration of the timeline discrepancy. It exists completely separately from the ledger." She looked ahead at the road. "And Dross. He witnessed Murtaugh give the order in the land office. He witnessed the push at the canyon rim. That's attempted murder current not 10 years ago, not documented by a dead man. Briggs can act on that today. The ledger is what you build on after you've opened the door," August said. "Exactly. Dross opens the door. Orvilla frames the threshold. The ledger is the room." Orvilla, riding on Cora's other side, had been listening. "Your father said something similar," she said. "When he came to see me, he said the truth doesn't need a sympathetic audience. It just needs a precise one." Cora looked at her. Orvilla met the look steadily, and in her eyes was the specific quality of a person who has been keeping something for a long time, and is finally, after a very long wait, putting it in the hands of someone capable of using it. They made Prescott in 2 days, stopping one night in the high country east of the main road in the junipers and pinon, where the temperature dropped enough that a fire was welcome, and the air smelled of resin rather than dust. Dross ate what he was given and said nothing, and slept with his wrists bound to a saddle ring, and Auguste 5 feet away with a rifle across his knees. In the morning, he was exactly where they had left him. She thought she understood his calculation. A man who had spent his working life close to people like Murtaugh understood better than most the precise and transactional nature of that proximity. An employee who had failed a significant assignment, who had not only failed, but had been captured by the party, he was sent to eliminate, and was now being transported toward the federal authority, whose attention Murtaugh most feared was worth to Murtaugh exactly nothing. Worse than nothing, an active liability, a source of information about Murtaugh's operations that Murtaugh could not control or predict. The marshal's office was the only place in the territory where Declan Murtaugh could not reach him. Dross had done the arithmetic. He was riding toward it. Prescott carried itself with the weight of institutional permanence. Wider streets than Redemption two-story buildings, with proper facades that had been built to last rather than to accommodate a boom and survive a bust. A courthouse with columns, offices with proper signage. The marshal's office on the south side of the Central Plaza plain adobe. A government seal above the door, 2 deputies visible through the front window, who looked like men who were there because they were supposed to be there, rather than because they had nowhere else to be. Cora tied Patience to the rail outside. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment, not gathering herself. She had gathered herself over 2 days of riding, but simply noting the moment before it became the next one. She straightened her coat. She walked through the door. Tatum Briggs was shorter than she had imagined and older, mid-60s with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had been lived in so extensively that it had acquired the particular quality of old leather, which is not smoothness or softness, but a kind of increased fidelity to its own nature, more itself with age rather than less. His eyes were the pale amber brown of creek water over sandstone, and they moved over her with the comprehensive attention of a man who had spent 4 decades practicing the specific skill of determining whether the person in front of him was telling the truth. He had 2 deputies in the room. He did not ask her to sit. She spoke without preamble. Marshal Briggs, my name is Cora Hartwell. My father was Weston Hartwell government surveyor, filed a land claim in Yavapai County, died in May. The death was recorded as fever, but I can demonstrate it was not. I have a ledger belonging to Reuben Calloway of the Red Rock Gang, the full accounting of 3 years of criminal operations in the Copper Hollow country, with the name Declan Murtaugh as organizer on nearly every page. I have personal letters from Calloway in which he describes Murtaugh's orchestration of the massacre at Broken Spur Pass in the spring of 1882 and the theft of a federal government gold shipment. I have an eyewitness who saw Murtaugh leaving Broken Spur Pass before midnight on the night of the massacre, before the official account has the posse riding out. I have a man currently in your county who works for Murtaugh and who was present when Murtaugh gave the order and witnessed the attempt to murder me at Copper Hollow 12 days ago. And I have my father's note in his handwriting, which names you specifically and instructs me to find you. She stopped. The office was very still. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her to August, to Orvilla, to Dross, with his bound wrists standing near the door, with the resigned composure of a man who has arrived somewhere he has decided not to fight. He pulled a chair from behind his desk and placed it in front of her. "Sit down, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Start at the beginning and take your time." She started at the beginning and took her time. She told it the way she had told it to August in sequence, precisely without interpretation of the facts, because the facts interpreted themselves when presented in the correct order. Briggs interrupted frequently. His interruptions were targeted at the load-bearing points of the account, the places where the structure depended most on her precision, and where if she were inventing or misremembering, the seams would show. She answered each one directly. When she was inferring, she said she was inferring. When she was stating fact, she showed the document. He spent 40 minutes with the ledger alone, moving through it with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew what he was looking for. He cross-referenced entries against each other, matched dates against the timeline she had laid out, paused at names with the stillness of recognition. He called in his clerk, a young man with the focused attention of someone who understood that his function in this moment was precision rather than speed. The clerk examined the ledger's physical properties, the binding, the paper stock, the ink. Iron gall ink, the clerk said, his voice careful and quiet. Consistent with the period in question. The paper is machine-made, but pre-1885 stock. The binding is hand-stitched, typical of ledgers produced in this territory in the 1870s and early 1880s. The wear pattern on the spine is consistent with regular use over a period of years. He looked up. I see nothing inconsistent with the claimed date of origin. In my assessment, this is authentic. Briggs took Orvilla into the back room and closed the door. She was in there for 50 minutes. When she came out, her face was the same as when she went in, composed and clear-eyed, but carrying something different in the set of her shoulders, something lighter. The specific quality of a person who has finally set down a weight they have been carrying for a very long time. She met Cora's eyes as she sat. She nodded once. Briggs took Dross. Dross was in the back room for 25 minutes. When he came out, he looked the way people look when they have made an irrevocable decision and have arrived on the other side of making it not at peace, not comfortable, but settled in the way of a person who has closed a door that cannot be reopened. Briggs returned to the main office. He stood behind his desk and looked at the documents spread across its surface, the ledger, the letters, the note in Cora's father's handwriting, and at the 4 people in front of him. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way that a precise man is quiet when he is confirming an assessment before stating it. Dross has confessed to witnessing Murtaugh order your removal to Copper Hollow and your attempted murder at the canyon rim, he said. He looked at the ledger. He has also confessed to being present at 2 additional incidents in the past year that constitute assault under federal statute. He paused. 3 days ago, I received a communication from the Sheriff of Redemption, a man named Burl Endon, stating that a young woman named Cora Hartwell was wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of federal gold from a cache in the Copper Hollow area. He looked at her steadily. Cora held his gaze without moving. Murtaugh sent that communication, Briggs said. He knew you were alive. He didn't know what you were carrying. He moved to discredit your testimony before you could deliver it. He looked at the ledger. He also, according to a source I have in Redemption, sent men to Copper Hollow 2 days ago with coal oil. The chamber, August said. He believes it's destroyed, Briggs said. He believes that with the physical cache destroyed, any claim you make is uncorroborated, a young woman's word against a decade of established standing in the territory. He looked at Cora. She reached into her satchel. She removed the ledger, the letters, and her father's note, and stacked them in the center of the desk. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her coat, the pocket she had worn against her body through 2 days of riding, and removed a second document folded in oilcloth, slightly thicker than a single page. She placed it beside the stack. "The morning after August and I first visited the chamber," she said, "I made a complete written summary of the ledger's contents. Every name, every date, every amount, every notation. Cross-reference to the ledger by page number written in my own hand." She looked at Briggs. "I kept the original ledger with August and I carried the summary separately. If Murtaugh had stopped us on the road and taken my satchel, the ledger would have arrived safely. If he had taken August, the summary would have arrived instead." She paused. "My father taught me that a single copy of anything important is the same as no copy at all." Briggs looked at the summary. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Cora, with the amber eyes that had spent 4 decades reading people. And something moved in them. Not warmth in the conventional sense, but something adjacent, the specific expression of a man who has been doing difficult work for a long time, and has occasionally encountered someone who understands at the same level of rigor why the work is difficult. "Your father taught you well," he said. "Yes," Cora said. "He did." Briggs stood. "I'm going to deputize Mr. Fenn under federal statute," he said. "I'm going to ride to Redemption with 4 deputies and the full authority of this office." He looked at Cora. "I'd like you present, not because your presence is legally required, because you've earned the right to be there." She said yes. They rode out that afternoon, 7 of them. Briggs and his 4 deputies, August with the deputy badge pinned to his coat, and Cora on patience. Dross remained in Prescott under guard, his usefulness as a traveling companion having concluded. Orvila rode east on her own road toward her homestead by a route that kept her clear of Redemption until the question of her safety in that town had been settled. The ride took the rest of that day and the first hours of the following morning. They arrived at first light, coming in from the north on the main road directly and without concealment. Briggs did not operate through stealth when he had sufficient cause because concealment implied a doubt he did not have. The smell of Redemption reached her before the rooftops, the dust and the wood smoke and the mineral tang of the canyon country baking through the night. And then the town assembled itself in the early light, the steeple, the saloons, the wide unpaved main street. Declan Murtaugh was standing in front of his bank. He had been warned. She knew it the moment she saw him. The position too deliberate, the suit too correct for the hour, the posture of a man who had been told something was coming, and had decided that the response to what was coming was to be visible, to be present, to occupy the space of a legitimate man with nothing to hide. He had made his preparations. He had his arguments. He had the communication he had sent to Briggs, and the accusations it contained, and the reputation he had spent 10 years building in this valley. He saw Cora. In the fraction of a second that followed, briefer than a breath, shorter than the time it took, the eye to blink, something passed across his face that was none of the things it usually was. Not composure, not authority, not the practiced confidence of a man who has managed his own narrative for so long that the narrative has become the reality. It was the expression of a man who has built something complex and interlocking, and has seen for the first time that the foundation is not what he believed. Then his face closed back into its usual arrangement, and he stepped off the boardwalk into the street. "Marshal Briggs," he said. His voice was even and practiced the voice of a man who had been controlling rooms for 30 years and intended to control this one. "I'm glad you've come. I have concerns about a young woman who has been making false accusations." "Declan Murtaugh," Briggs said. He did not dismount. "I am placing you under arrest on charges of conspiracy in the murder of federal citizens during the Red Rock Gang suppression of April 1882, theft of federal property, obstruction of federal process, and the attempted murder of Cora Hartwell, a private citizen at Copper Hollow on the 14th of this month. You have the right to answer these charges before the territorial court in Prescott." The street had gone quiet in the way of streets in small towns when something significant begins to happen, not by virtue of anyone calling for quiet, but through the organic cessation of movement that occurs when people recognize that the thing happening in front of them is worth stopping for. Shopkeepers in their doorways, women who had been walking to the market with their baskets now standing still, men from the saloon who had come out onto the boardwalk at the sound of arriving horses holding their coffee or their morning whiskey watching. The clerk from the land office standing on the boardwalk with his hands in his pockets, watching with the expression of a man whose carefully maintained neutrality had just been released from an obligation it had held for 10 years. They were all watching. Murtaugh looked at the deputies. He looked at August with the badge. He looked at Cora. Something moved behind his eyes, a fast, comprehensive calculation, the kind of calculation a man makes when he has been in difficult situations before, and has always found a way through, and is assessing whether this situation is different. "This woman," he began. "Mr. Murtaugh," Cora said. Her voice was not loud. The street was silent enough that she did not need it to be. She was close to him, closer than was comfortable, close enough that he could not address the crowd without speaking past her, and she had been thinking about this moment since the chamber, since the canyon floor. Since the morning she had understood what her father's note meant. She reached into her coat and removed a single folded page. Not the ledger, not the summary, but a page she had written out the night before. They left Prescott in the hotel room, where she had slept briefly, and spent the rest of the hours before dawn, composing what she was going to say, and to whom. She held it where the people on the boardwalk could see it. "Reuben Calloway wrote a letter before he died," she said. "He wrote about an honest man who came to find him in his last weeks, a surveyor. Calloway wrote he was the only honest man I met in that valley. I told him everything. I hope his daughter, if he has one, never comes looking." She looked at Murtaugh. "That man was my father," she said. "Weston Hartwell. You had him killed because he found what you hid in Copper Hollow, because he found Calloway's second ledger and understood what it proved, because an honest man knowing the truth was something you could not allow." She looked away from him to the people on the boardwalk. "Reuben Calloway kept 2 copies of his accounts," she said. "The one Murtaugh holds, the one he received as the price of false pardons. And the one I found in the canyon Murtaugh threw me into and left me to die in." She held up the page. "These are the names from those accounts. the people of this town who helped build what Murtaugh built. She read the names: Dr. Amos Vetch, Sheriff Burl Endon, Clement Hasker, Druitt Farnham, Abe Salter. Each name fell into the silence of the street with the specific weight of a thing that has been held in private for a long time and has just encountered air. She watched the faces on the boardwalk as she read the recognition, the confirmation of long-held suspicion, the complicated expression of people who have known something, in the way that communities know things without being able to say what they know, and who are now hearing it said. When she finished, she folded the page and put it in her coat. Murtaugh had not moved during the reading. His face had not changed to anger or defiance, or the theatrical denial of a man who has not yet understood the scope of what is arrayed against him. Instead, something more fundamental had happened to it. The authoritative composure, the careful performance of legitimacy, the 30 years of construction, it was gone. What remained underneath was something much simpler and much older. The face of a man who understands that it is over. He looked at Cora. She looked back. He looked away first. Briggs nodded to 2 of his deputies. They dismounted and moved to Murtaugh with the brisk professional efficiency of men who had done this before and whose function was to accomplish the task rather than to comment on it. The irons went on. Murtaugh did not resist. He walked to the prison wagon at the end of the street with the empty expression of a man who is no longer present in the way that would make resistance meaningful. Sheriff Burl Endon was taken from his office, where he had been sitting behind his desk, when the deputies arrived, which suggested he had known something was coming and had decided that the most defensible position was the one associated with his official function. He came out into the morning light, blinking, and diminished the authority he had borrowed from Murtaugh, evaporating the moment there was nothing left to borrow it from. Dr. Amos Vetch was taken from his surgery. He was still holding a medical instrument, a small forceps, the kind used for minor procedures when the deputies arrived at his door. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down carefully on his instrument tray, with the precision of a man for whom the habits of his profession were so deeply ingrained that they operated even in the moment of their final expression. He came to the door without resistance. Clement Hasker was found at the general store. Druitt Farnham at his notary office, which still had its shingle out. Abe Salter at the livery. Each of them came out into the morning light with the specific diminishment of people whose stature had been a function of what they were associated with rather than what they were, and who now understood that the association was over. By midday, the prison wagon had left for Prescott. The main street of Redemption had resumed its ordinary movement, but with a quality that would take time to identify, because it had been absent for so long that no one living in the town had an easy reference for it. It was the absence of a particular kind of weight. Lyle Hammond, who ran the general store, and whose name had not appeared in the ledger, because his role in the situation had been one of fear rather than complicity, found Cora on the boardwalk in the early afternoon. He was a man in his 60s, with the permanent apologetic stoop of someone who has been making himself smaller than his natural size for a long time. He stood in front of her with his hat in his hands. "Your father came into my store 3 times in the weeks before he died," he said. I knew he was looking at something. I could see it in the way he moved through town. I didn't ask what because I told myself it wasn't my business. He turned his hat in his hands. It was my business. It was everyone's business. I'm sorry I didn't ask. Cora looked at him. He was not Murtaugh. He was not Vetch or Endon. He was a man who had made the calculation that silence was safer than speech and was standing in front of her now because the calculation had changed and because he was in his diminished way genuinely sorry. She understood the calculation. She had seen it made by people with much better reasons than his. "I know," she said. He nodded and went back inside, and she thought that this was probably as much as could be asked of him, and it was enough. August found her at the edge of town in the late afternoon, standing at the southern road, looking toward the canyon country. The trestle would be out there, invisible. At this distance, but present, catching the last light in its particular way, gray and enormous, and still making its sound in the evening wind. He stood beside her, and they looked at the southern distance. "Briggs confirmed your father's claim is valid," August said. "He spoke to the land office this afternoon. The Weston Hartwell filing on Copper Hollow is legitimate and it transfers to you." He paused. "He also said the territorial government intends to allocate a portion of the criminal forfeiture from Murtaugh's assets to community restitution. He mentioned a schoolhouse and a doctor, a real one from back east." Cora thought about Orvila, who had held her silence for 10 years and had ridden 2 days on an 8-mile round trip to give her statement when the time was finally right. She thought about Hammond with his apologetic stoop and his decade of careful neutrality standing in front of her with his hat. She thought about the morning she had arrived in Redemption on the stagecoach with a broken satchel strap and $4 and a manila envelope she had been told was worthless. "My father said the land was a start," she said. "Not because of what it held, because it was ours. It was somewhere to begin from." "The spring is still there," August said. "Under the canyon. It doesn't know what happened above it." She looked at the southern distance. The light was going copper, the specific color of Arizona, at the last hour of the day, when the harshness relents and something else moves into the space. It leaves not softness, but a kind of reckoning the land makes with the sky at the end of every day, wordless and complete. "I'm going to build on it," she said. "The claim, my father's land." She thought about the chamber under the canyon, the cool air and the stone floor, and the silver thread of water, moving through the passage patient and continuous, finding its way upward through fissures that no one had mapped, because no one who surveyed that canyon had believed there was anything there worth looking for. Not because of what's in the canyon, because of what it cost to find it. Auguste was quiet for a moment, looking at the same distance. "I'll help," he said. "If you want it." She looked at him. He was still looking south in the way of a man who is making an offer and leaving the response entirely to the other person's geography. "You have a ranch," she said. "I have fences that need mending, and a water trough with a bad fitting, and a cabin that's too quiet," he said. "The ranch will keep. A fence doesn't require a particular person to mend it." He paused. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. "She would have understood what you did in that chamber with the lantern in the dark. She would have appreciated the part with the plumb bob." Cora looked at the southern distance. She thought about her father kneeling in the dirt of a dry creek bed in Texas, turning a piece of limestone in his hands, saying each line is a season, each color is a condition. The land writes everything down. You just have to learn to read it. She thought about him in the chamber in the months before she arrived. Finding the passage, descending to the chamber, opening the lockbox, reading Calloway's ledger, understanding its implications, writing 6 lines on a folded piece of paper and placing it in a waxed canvas packet and putting it where she would eventually find it. Trusting her to come, trusting her to find what he had found, trusting her to do what he had not had time to do. He had been right to trust her. She was going to be right to trust the land. Come in the spring, she said, when the weather is better for building. Bring whatever tools you have that are good. He nodded once. It was settled in the way that things are settled between people, for whom words are a formality after the understanding has already been reached. The sun went down. The Arizona sky above the canyon country went through its progression of colors. The hammered copper, the blood red, the deep, bruised purple of the last light before. Dark, and the stars came out in the east. First, as they always did, the ancient and reliable ones that her father had taught her to navigate by in the years when navigation had seemed like the most important skill the world could offer. She watched them come out one by one, the fixed things in a world that had just shifted significantly beneath her feet and was still settling. She thought about what Murtaugh had said in the land office on the day she arrived, when he picked up her father's claim and laughed. Copper Hollow eats men whole, he had said. Barren rock and lizards. He had been telling her that the canyon was an ending. She had gone into it and found what her father had found, and she had carried it out, and it had been sufficient. The chamber was empty now. The gold and the crates and the chests, already the subject of a federal recovery operation, documented and catalogued and on their way to their proper disposition. The oilcloth document bundles were in evidence boxes in Prescott. The ledger was on Briggs's desk. The letters were in an archive. The spring was still there. The water that had been moving upward through the fissures in that sandstone, for as long as the canyon had existed, was still moving, patient and indifferent, and entirely unaffected by everything that had happened above it. It would be there when she arrived in the spring with a wagon and tools and plans for a cabin. It would be there for the cabin's foundation, and for the garden she was going to plant, and for every dry season that followed. The driest ground remembers the deepest water. She turned from the southern distance and walked back toward the town, toward the livery, where Patience was stabled, toward the boarding house, where she had taken a room for the night before, the road north in the morning. The evening star was up, the first star visible after sunset, hanging above the western horizon in the last of the light. The canyon country was dark. Out there in the dark, invisible at this distance, the Cathedral of Bones was doing what it always did, in the night wind breathing its low, resonant sound, across the empty miles, speaking in the language of old timber and desert air, the long and patient language of things built to outlast the circumstances that produced them. Cora Hartwell was 19 years old. She had arrived in Redemption, Arizona territory on a stagecoach in the summer of 1889, carrying a broken satchel and $4, and a claim on a canyon that a man in a good suit had laughed at. She had been thrown into the canyon and left there. She had gone down into the place they threw her, and she had followed the water, and she had found what her father had found, and she had carried it up through the rock and into the light, and it had been sufficient for everything it needed to be sufficient for. The gold was not the treasure. She had understood this in the chamber in the dark, pressed against the cold stone wall, with her father's note against her sternum, and the sound of the flood above, and the cool air moving around her. The gold was what Murtaugh had wanted, and the gold was what had brought him to where he was now, which was nowhere. The gold was what Calloway had died protecting, and what her father had died for not wanting. The treasure was the water. The treasure was the land her father had believed in enough to die for, and which she was going to be alive to build on. The treasure was the truth which had been patient for 10 years in a sealed tin box, in a cool stone chamber, under a played-out canyon in the middle of nowhere, and had finally found the person willing to carry it up into the air, which was the only thing the truth had ever needed. Not a hero, not a warrior, just someone patient enough and trained enough and stubborn enough and angry enough at the right things to follow the water when everyone else was looking at the walls. She walked through the quiet evening town of Redemption, which was breathing differently than it had been this morning. And she thought about the spring and the cabin and the garden and the first season of work on her father's land, and the spring after that, and the one after that, each one laying down its own line in the record a season, a condition the land writing everything down. She was going to learn to read this land. She already had the ear for it. Her father had taught her well.